Imagine the most powerful battleship in history, the Yamato, sailing directly toward you. You are on a lightly armored jeep carrier. The main fleet that was supposed to protect you, gone. This is the unbelievable story of Task Force Taffy 3, the sacrificial lambs who had to fight an entire enemy battle line with courage as their only weapon. Rewind. The Pacific in 1944. A vast, swirling canvas of war. For 3 years, the United States Navy had chased the enemy across the ocean, culminating in the critical invasion of Leyte in the Philippines. This was a dagger plunged into the heart of the Japanese Empire, signaling the beginning of the end of Japan's ability to wage war effectively. But the Imperial Japanese Navy, though grievously wounded, was not yet broken. They clung to a desperate, last-ditch military doctrine, the Shogo Plan, a strategic trap designed to sacrifice their remaining ships to utterly destroy the American landing forces. The cost in lives or steel was deemed irrelevant. The continued existence of the empire was everything, driving this audacious strategy. The Japanese High Command deployed its remaining naval assets. The steel fist of the plan was the center force, the largest concentration of battleships ever assembled, a core of overwhelming firepower. At its heart was the undisputed king of the waves, the mighty Yamato. Their mission was brutal and simple. Rush through the unguarded San Bernardino Strait and obliterate the vulnerable supply ships massed off the Leyte beaches, thereby strangling the American invasion. The key to initiating this dangerous gambit lay in the north, with Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa. Ozawa commanded what was tragically a ghost fleet, the last 4 remaining Japanese aircraft carriers, with virtually no operational aircraft left. Their real function was not to launch planes or engage in combat, but to act as a colossal, irresistible lure for the main American Third Fleet, commanded by the aggressive and ambitious Admiral William Bull Halsey. Halsey was an American legend, a commander obsessed with the power of the aircraft carrier. In October 1944, he possessed the most powerful, modern armada on Earth. When Ozawa's carrier fleet appeared on his radar to the north, it was the target Halsey had dreamed of, a final, tempting opportunity to wipe the last of the enemy's carrier arm off the map in one glorious, decisive blow. Halsey took the bait, hook, line, and sinker. The lure was too great, eclipsing caution. He detached all 16 carriers, all 6 battleships, and their heavy escorts, and began a rapid, full-speed sprint north. The monumental chase was on. It was a massive, calculated risk, yet Halsey saw only the prize of total victory against the Japanese air arm. But what he didn't realize was that the greatest fleet of battleships ever assembled was now staring straight at the most vulnerable fleet in the entire US Navy. In his haste, driven by ambition, he failed to leave a single battleship, or even a single heavy cruiser, to guard the San Bernardino Strait, the very route the center force, the real threat, was using to sneak through the vast, open ocean. This monumental, colossal error left the entire American invasion force exposed to the deadliest enemy surface fleet in the world. The massive, powerful Third Fleet was hours away, speeding toward a decoy. The only forces left to protect the soft underbelly of the invasion, the thousands of transport ships and the 600,000 soldiers struggling for survival on Leyte, were 2 small task units of escort carriers and their meager screens. These were slow, lightly armored units, the naval equivalent of Border Patrol. They were known simply as Taffy 2 and Taffy 3. Their combined strength, measured in heavy guns and armor, was less than 1% of the power Halsey had taken with him on his northward dash. If you enjoy these deep dives into history's most unbelievable victories, please take a moment to subscribe to our channel. Your support helps us bring more of these cinematic stories to life. As Halsey steamed north, the Japanese center force, commanded by Admiral Takeo Kurita, was battling its way through a different gauntlet, the deep, cold waters where American submarines stalked. Kurita had suffered heavy losses in the days prior, but he continued his course with steely resolve, emerging from the San Bernardino Strait completely undetected. The passage was clear, the way to the American transports unobstructed, a sight that must have filled Kurita with grim satisfaction. The distance separating Kurita's unstoppable force and the thin line of defenders guarding the Leyte transports was closing rapidly, minute by minute. The entire fate of the Philippines campaign, and indeed the war itself, now rested upon the shoulders of a few dozen slow, unarmored ships and their even smaller escorts. These men, completely ignorant of Halsey's strategic blunder that had abandoned them, were about to face a nightmare that no naval officer could have rationally conceived. A force of battleships that should have been 1,000 miles away. They were completely alone, utterly exposed, and sailing toward a dawn that would bring with it the thunder of the largest guns ever made. The Japanese Leviathans were now through the bottleneck and charging toward their goal. Tomorrow, the sun would rise over a calm stretch of water near Samar, and the men of Taffy 3 would awaken to the sight of a nightmare made of steel and fire. Far from the high-stakes game of admirals and their strategic blunders, the true deadly conflict was brewing on a quiet stretch of water near Samar. This was the hunting ground of the Japanese center force, commanded by Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita. This was a force designed for absolute annihilation. This was the largest gathering of heavy Japanese ships left, comprising 4 battleships, 6 heavy, cruisers, 2 light cruisers, and 11 destroyers. At the center of this terrifying formation was the battleship Yamato. The Yamato was a floating fortress, a monument to military engineering and power. Her displacement was 72,000 tons, and her armor belt was 26 inches thick, making her virtually impervious to the guns of any ship Taffy 3 possessed. Her main armament consisted of 9 18.1-inch guns, the largest naval rifles ever mounted on a warship. Each shell weighed 3,200 pounds, capable of hitting targets 26 miles away. This monster was now aimed at 6 tiny ships whose main armor was just a 1/4 inch of steel. The disparity was not military, it was biblical. Opposing this mighty, organized terror was Task Unit 77.4.3, Taffy 3. Taffy 3 consisted of 6 small, slow escort carriers. These vessels were hastily constructed on converted tanker hulls, lightly armored, and sometimes derisively called jeep carriers. They carried 500-pound bombs and depth charges, weapons completely unsuited for penetrating the Yamato's armor. For protection, they had only 7 small screen ships, 3 Fletcher-class destroyers, the USS Hole, the USS Heermann, and the USS Johnston, and 4 even smaller, lighter destroyer escorts, including the USS Samuel B. Roberts. The disparity was monstrous. The Yamato alone weighed more than all 6 of Taffy 3's escort carriers combined. Kurita's heavy cruiser shells could pass straight through the escort carriers with catastrophic effect. The destroyer's 5-inch guns were entirely useless against the heavy armor of the Japanese battleships. The destroyer escorts carried even fewer torpedoes and were only designed to hunt submarines, not engage a battle fleet. These men of Taffy 3 sailed just to the east of Samar, maintaining their station. The notion that the largest, deadliest concentration of Japanese surface ships would be rushing straight at them was simply unthinkable, defying all known intelligence and naval doctrine. Kurita's center force was now closing the trap. Though he felt nervous tension, expecting resistance, he continued his approach. His objective was now within range, the defenseless landing fleet. The clock was ticking on the fate of the American troops on Leyte. The only thing standing between Kurita's 12,000-man naval strike force and total victory was a handful of ships with virtually no defensive capability. It was an impossible situation where the odds were non-existent. These tiny ships and their crews were now facing the terrifying truth. Admiral Halsey's rush to glory had left them exposed to the very weapon that was supposed to have been thousands of miles away. They were alone in the vast Pacific, two forces hurtling toward a collision that promised only total devastation for the smaller fleet. The sun was rising on the dawn of October 25th, 1944, and the quiet waters of Samar were about to turn crimson. Dawn, October 25th, 1944. The sky was still the sickly grey of pre-morning, but a lookout on the USS Fanshawe Bay, Admiral Sprague's flagship, caught a distinct silhouette against the rising sun. The time was 6:45 in the morning. The initial report was tentative, but as the shapes grew clearer, the truth became monstrously evident. The formation was vast, stretching the entire width of the horizon and closing fast. The silhouettes were not cruisers. They were the towering, armored superstructures of battleships, their immense bulk undeniable. The entire Japanese center force was less than 20 miles away. The feeling on the bridge of the Fanshawe Bay was a cold, sickening shock of realization. The radar confirmed the terrifying size of the enemy: 4 battleships, 6 heavy cruisers, and 11 destroyers. At that moment, every man on Taffy 3 knew the truth. They were trapped. There was no friendly support within hundreds of miles. The opening salvos were immediate, horrifying, and decisive. The largest guns in naval history boomed across the water, the concussive sound rolling over the waves. The Yamato fired her 18.1-inch shells. Vast plumes of water, geysers of doom, erupted around the tiny carriers, the shrapnel alone tearing at their light hulls. The first salvos were designed to crush them instantly. Admiral Sprague, faced with an extinction-level event, issued the only orders he could: a desperate, brilliant gambit. He ordered the escort carriers to turn and run at their maximum speed, a pathetic 17 knots, and to launch every single plane they had. Pilots were told to attack, even if they only had depth charges or unarmed spotting runs. The objective was to confuse the enemy, not to sink them. Simultaneously, the destroyers and destroyer escorts were ordered to make the thickest smokescreen possible. This was not a retreat. It was an act of tactical camouflage. The destroyers had to screen the carriers long enough for the planes to get airborne and for the slow carriers to flee. It was a delaying action with no hope of success. It was a sacrificial mission, the last thin hope of the invasion. In the midst of this chaos, one man decided the fate of the entire American invasion force. Commander Ernest Evans, captain of the destroyer USS Johnston, did not wait for the smoke to bloom. Without waiting for a direct order from Sprague, Evans barked the order to his crew, his voice ringing with fierce resolve. "I am heading for the biggest target I see, and I am going to charge straight through their column." The USS Johnston, a 3,000-ton vessel, broke formation and drove straight toward the oncoming wave of steel, becoming the first American ship to engage the Japanese center force. This single, defiant act was the seed of courage that would soon spread through the entire doomed formation. It was an all-in attack based on pure, fierce American resolve. Johnston was heading toward the enemy, disappearing into the spray and the smoke, leaving the rest of the fleet to grapple with the terrifying knowledge that they were now truly alone. It was an action that defied every rule of naval warfare, a death-defying action where the smallest ships turned to face the largest. The USS Johnston, under Commander Ernest Evans, was the first to disappear into the massive wall of black smoke, driving straight toward the Yamato and her escorting battle line. The Johnston made its initial, crippling torpedo attack, closing to point-blank range of the enemy line. Evans's men successfully fired their 10 torpedoes. Though the Yamato was untouched, the heavy cruiser Kumano took a direct hit to the bow, ripping it open and forcing the massive ship out of the battle entirely. The effect was immediate. The Japanese battle line was forced to take evasive maneuvers, disrupting their tight attack formation. But the price was paid instantly. The Johnston was ravaged by a storm of shells from multiple cruisers. The bridge was wiped out, the engine room crippled, and the ship was engulfed in flames. Commander Evans, having lost 2 fingers, directed his vessel from the open stern deck, steering by emergency hand controls, his ship battered, but not broken. The Johnston was crippled, but its sacrifice had just bought the other ships a single minute. Now, who would use it? This act of raw sacrifice inspired the rest of the tiny screening force. 2 other ships immediately joined the fray. The USS Hole and the smallest, most vulnerable ship of all, the destroyer escort USS Samuel B. Roberts, barely larger than a tugboat, began their own reckless charges. The Roberts fired its entire rack of torpedoes, then, in an act of staggering audacity, closed on a Japanese heavy cruiser. The crew fought with reckless abandon, firing 5-inch shells that shredded antennae and superstructure. An observer noted that the Roberts fought with the heart of a battleship. The enemy cruiser, enraged, finally turned its massive guns on the small destroyer escort, reducing the Roberts to a shattered hulk. The ship began to sink beneath the waves, but its sacrifice had won precious minutes of life for the carriers. Meanwhile, the destroyer USS Heermann performed one of the most audacious maneuvers of the day. Steaming through the dense smoke and the blinding geysers of explosions, the Heermann charged right between the massive bulk of the Yamato and another Japanese battleship. The Heermann fired its torpedoes at the Yamato itself, forcing the giant battleship to turn sharply to avoid the spread. This maneuver was absolutely critical. To keep the Yamato turning meant to keep its massive guns from sighting the defenseless American carriers. The combined, relentless aggression of these tiny sinking ships achieved the impossible. They did not sink the enemy, battleships, but they shattered Kurita's formation, pulled the heavy cruisers away from the carriers, and created utter, bewildering chaos. They had fought with the strength of giants, and they were overwhelmed in the process, their ships taking devastating hits. Their sacrifice had made the mighty Admiral Kurita hesitate. If you find yourself deeply moved by the incredible selflessness of these heroes, please leave a comment below, sharing your thoughts on this unbelievable battle. It helps us keep the history alive. The destroyers were sinking, the carriers were still fleeing, desperately launching every remaining aircraft, but the sheer ferocity of the counterattack had sowed the seeds of doubt in the Japanese command, paving the way for the most significant error of the entire engagement. The Japanese battleships were mere miles from the defenseless escort carriers, their victory absolutely certain, yet they were sailing through a storm of fire and confusion. The American destroyers were sinking, their crews abandoning their ravaged ships, but their sacrificial charge had achieved the impossible. It had made the mighty Admiral Kurita halt his advance. Kurita's perspective was one of complete and utter confusion. He had been promised that the powerful American Third Fleet was chasing a decoy far to the north. Yet, he had just witnessed an attack of unparalleled ferocity. Continuous airstrikes, heavy torpedo attacks that had damaged his heavy cruisers, and the relentless, final, desperate charge of American destroyers. He was convinced he was facing the main battle fleet, supported by an array of heavy ships that must have been hidden in the smoke. The final element of doubt was the relentless, albeit lightly armed, air attacks. The plane crews, out of proper armor-piercing ammunition, were resorting to fake runs, dropping depth charges to simulate torpedo attacks, or strafing the heavy decks with machine gun fire, simply to create noise and chaos. The Japanese sailors were exhausted and bombarded by a constant stream of harassment that convinced them they were fighting a coordinated, full-scale assault, not a handful of screens. Facing a damaged formation, believing he was about to be flanked by a superior American force, and convinced that the main objective of destroying the American carriers was complete, Kurita made the single most significant tactical error of the Pacific War. He ordered his entire fleet to break off the engagement, regroup, and then, inexplicably, ordered a full retreat. It was the conqueror's pause. With a completely clear path to the supply transports off Leyte, and with total victory assured, Kurita turned his battleships around and sailed away into the open sea. It was an act of tactical paralysis that saved the American invasion. The Japanese commander had been psychologically defeated by the ferocious, desperate, and completely irrational defiance of a handful of small ships. The victory, however, came at a terrible price. The USS Gambier Bay became the only American carrier ever sunk by surface fire in the war, and the Johnston, the Hole, and the Samuel B. Roberts were all sunk, taking hundreds of brave American sailors with them into the depths. Commander Ernest Evans, who had initiated the defiant charge, perished with his ship, a hero to the last. The Battle off Samar, the desperate action of Taffy 3, secured the American foothold in the Philippines. It was a victory achieved not by power, but by the sheer, unyielding courage of ordinary men who refused to accept defeat. The American historian Samuel Eliot Morison called it the most glorious pages of naval history. The legacy of the 7 little ships and their crews endures as a powerful testament to the impact of leadership, resolve, and sacrifice. The victory at Leyte Gulf stabilized the American position and crippled the Japanese Navy. Please share this story with anyone who loves true tales of heroism and unbelievable courage. It's a story that deserves to be remembered. The sacrifice of Taffy 3 serves as a powerful reminder that history is not always made by the largest armies or the biggest guns, but by the biggest hearts. Their heroism remains one of the greatest military upsets in history. If you want to see more stories about the incredible battles that shaped our world, make sure to like this video and subscribe to our channel. And let us know in the comments what piece of history you think deserves to be told next.